the internet, can it be erased? And of course, blockchains pose a unique problem in that regard. So what we're going to discuss is the inherent conflict between blockchain and privacy regulations, rethinking the concept of immutability, scenarios to resolve the conflict, and I'll show you some flow charts of some alternative ways to do this, and then we'll discuss some real world implementation issues. And I welcome your questions along the way. So we'll start out with the conflict, which was pretty basic. On the left, you have privacy rules. California has passed data privacy regulation. We have, as I say, in the EU, the General Data Protection Regulation, GDPR. Various states are passing their own privacy regulations, and globally it's becoming more and more important. And one of the issues in privacy is once you've published something, is there a way to take it back? Certainly in the non-digital world, that was somewhat easy. I mean, if you sent a document to somebody, you could ask for it back and destroy it, assuming they were willing to give it back. In the digital world, it's a bit harder. And so particularly in the area of blockchain, because blockchain, one of the major features of blockchain is immutable, which means it can't be changed. So if you have something out there, how could you possibly take something away from it? Because that's changing it. So that's the inherent conflict that we're facing. That picture of guzzling a liter of beer may have been fashionable as a college student, but it might not sit so well with some job interviewers. So that's kind of something you may have posted on social media. And as we move to Web3, where social media theoretically may be blockchain based, it becomes all the more of a concern. The fact that you were lured into paying some money to a Nigerian prince who sought your help in helping him move millions of dollars out of Nigeria might not be something that you may feel foolish about now, and you might not want that to show up, especially on your application for a job in law enforcement. Similarly, if you're posted certain sexual preferences in a dating app, you might not want that out there when you're running for office. So the issue is, can blockchain support this right to erasure? If indeed the world moves to a Web3 model where data are locked into blockchains to preserve their integrity, how do we support the right to erasure? So part of it is a matter of rethinking immutability. What if we maintain time sequence versions of blockchains? It wouldn't be quite like this version of yearbooks where each year is unique. This would cause anyone looking for this year's yearbook to lose the important provenance of the information that began in the past. But what if each year we republish the entire blockchain, but remove certain records from the current version? This would be similar to your bank statement, where your bank statement shows you what's current for the month. It doesn't show you what happened before, but those records are certainly available and they are stored. So if we kind of think of a blockchain as a possibility of a bank statement, I think you get the idea that possibly by version control, there may be some ability to republish the blockchain periodically. We can store the old version and just keep some of the new. Sounds very simple, as the headline here mentions, the devil's in the details. So one of the problems is if you take anything out of a blockchain, it corrupts the blockchain, and the whole nature of the blockchain with the way hashes are done and hashing the record before, if you remove anything from the blockchain, it will change the hash for that. And that will no longer match the hash of the next record. And basically wherever you made a change, it will ripple through the entire blockchain to the most current block, and those blocks will all be in error. So kind of reshuffling the deck, absolutely, this would require remining the new shortened version of the blockchain. We could still keep the original, but we would have to remine anything from the point at which we start removing records. But because all transactions have already been validated, this could be done in a highly automated process, merely reassembling the blocks with new hashes. It would not necessarily require mining or mining fees or miners, but of course that's up to the blockchain owners, which, depending on which blockchain you're using, could be the general public. The code for the entire process could be examined by experts and approved, so that you could make this an automated process where new hashes would be created. You'd mine a block, determine the next hash, mine the next block, etc., all kind of in an automated fashion without any interaction of the various players. But even that may be too simplistic. The example here is, if we have 5 + 0 = 5, but if we delete the 5, that record, how do we get to 5 at the end? So if Alice gave me 5 Bitcoin and she removed herself from the blockchain, how do I prove that I still own those 5 Bitcoin? The evidence would be lost. This could give hackers a field day. So I proposed something called net state integrity check. The net state is kind of the asset balance that every account has. Now, accounts, of course, don't have names on them. They're typically long coded numbers, but for simplicity, I'm just using Alice, Bob, and Carol here. So we'll start at time 0, and Alice has 20 assets. Maybe they're Bitcoin, maybe they're Ether, whatever they are. They could be widgets as far as I'm concerned. And the net state at time 0, she has 20, Bob has 0, and Carol has 0. The next time, T1, Alice gives 5 Bitcoin or widgets to Bob. So now the net state is, and this is basically unspent transaction outputs in the Bitcoin terminology. Alice now has 15, Bob has 5, Carol has 0. The total is still 20. We've neither created nor destroyed any. There have been no mining activities. At the next time, Bob takes his 5 Bitcoin and gives them to Carol. So in the net state, Alice still has 15, Bob now has 0, but Carol now has 5, and of course there's still a net of 20. If we were able to only remove accounts that had a net state of 0, we wouldn't have the integrity issue of not having this balance. So at this point, we could remove Bob if Bob decided he no longer wanted to have his transactions in the current version of the blockchain. As I say, it would still be in the original version. But because his net state is 0, if we remove him at this point, it will have no impact on the net state of all the different accounts. Carol's 5 Bitcoin are still accounted for. Doesn't show where they came from, but it shows that she has legitimate 5 Bitcoin. And one of the things this could also do, by removing Bob's history, we're actually shortening the amount of records stored in the current version of the blockchain. So that may be beneficial, since blockchains basically just continue to grow over time unceasingly, being able to bring it down a little bit every so often might be beneficial. It might increase speed. It might make it easier for some people to be able to have a copy of the blockchain on their computer because they don't need as much storage. Of course, it would all require proper authority to make sure that this is a doable transaction. So here we have kind of at the end, we have Alice now showing with 15, Carol with 5, and Bob has been removed. An alternative approach to merely removing Bob's records from the newly reshuffled blockchain uses the net state as a performance enhancer. The new blockchain doesn't transfer any of the transactions from the prior version. It just begins with what these net states are. So we won't know how Alice got her 15. We won't know how Carol got her 5 in the current version. But every account starts with the net state at the point where this transaction or translation was done. So you're not only removing just Bob's record, you're removing most of the blockchain, the bulk of it, and you're just starting everybody out with what their current balance is at the point in time where you do this translation. Again, think of it kind of as your bank statement. You're just seeing what you've got. When you get a bank statement, it usually shows your starting balance and your ending balance. So we're just going with the starting balance at the point of time where we perform this trimming. Basically, it's kind of almost like frozen orange juice. We're taking out all the water and making the database much smaller. Any questions so far? People follow what I'm trying to express here?
It would seem a hacker could, in theory, insert themselves at this point and just say that they have Bob's assets or something. There'd be no way to reconstruct where he got his Bitcoins.
Well, ultimately, you can still reconstruct it because you still have the original record. And there certainly are some issues to be tackled, but I think they're basically solvable issues. And depending on how much you value privacy and the ability and the right to erasure, those challenges may well be worth tackling. But these are decisions each blockchain would have to make based on its governance structure. And there are a couple different ways of doing it. So any other questions before I kind of go into the different alternatives? All right.
You really have a zero balance. If Bitcoins is all done in fractions, so you'd have to say transmit all my Bitcoins rather than 0.003.
I'm not quite following you. Can you restate that?
Your intent is to delete a person's line.
Anyone whose net state is 0 would be eliminated completely. And potentially you could also eliminate all prior records and just start everybody out with their current balance.
Since things are being done in fractions, can you really have a zero balance?
Oh, sure. I mean, if you have X amount of Bitcoin, well, there's a couple ways to deal with this problem. One is if you could just transfer all your Bitcoin, however many decimal points you need to use, to somebody else to get rid of it. Or you could just burn it. You could basically just give up ownership of those things so that you get to 0. Or even without being at 0, if you just elect to have your records removed, so that you could have a rule established where once you give that up, it's just gone. You know, it's like somebody who forgets their account number. It's gone for good, and you weren't actually at zero. But as I say, when you forget your account number, you know, you might have 30 Bitcoin, and if you can't remember what your account number is any longer, you've lost it. So in the same way, you could just give it up, assuming it was a trivial amount. You might well be willing to do so. Does that address your question, David?
Yes, I mean, it's just the same as being lost.
Yeah. I mean, lost, or as I say, you can transfer it to somebody. You have somebody you particularly like and the asset's something valuable. Just say, give them all my Bitcoin. And all right. So these are just some kind of flow charts showing how this might work. So the system receives a request and calculates the net state of the entire blockchain, of every account in the blockchain. It then goes through a qualification test to make sure that if indeed you only wanted to remove zero balance accounts, you would find those accounts that are at zero and remove them. The remaining account, then that's at 1650. If you could go down the other path, you have the remaining net states. You can create a new set of transactions, establishing those as kind of almost a seed for the new seed block for the new blockchain, basically everybody's net state, and then have those appended to the new blockchain. So that's one alternative. Another, basically the first three steps are the same. You receive a request, calculate the net state, qualify them. You remove qualifying transactions. You select the remaining transactions, and instead of necessarily just starting with the net state, you could transform those transactions. Just a moment here. So in a scenario like this, let's say Bob receives 5 widgets. He transfers 5 widgets to Carol. It's a reasonable scenario, but might not be doable in all situations, because there will likely be holes in the transaction history. But what you could do is you could annotate the new transactions to indicate that Bob had given those to Carol. Carol has those now. And even though there's no transaction showing the flow that went from Alice to Carol because you've removed Bob, you could make an annotation in that record that there was an intermediate party. I'm not sure if I'm clearly explaining that, but just starting with the net states of Alice and Carol, Alice having 15 Bitcoin and Carol having 5, we missed the fact that the 5 that Carol have emanated originally from Alice, because we've removed Bob. But there's no reason we couldn't make a note in Alice's account without mentioning Bob by name or by account number that those came from Alice indirectly. So that's kind of what this transforming the transaction would be. Another way to approach this is for the removed qualifying transactions, you create substitute transactions. So Bob wants his records removed. What you can do instead of actually just removing them is just substitute a placeholder for Bob. Everywhere where Bob's account number is referenced, you put in 9999, or you put in, a series, individual series of numbers, but it no longer has any relation to Bob. So that way, the blockchain tracking, you still see that the Bitcoin that went from Alice to Carol still go through this intermediate account, and there's still a record of that intermediate account. You just no longer have that record being tied to Bob. Am I making these things clear? I'll take silence as agreement. There are, as you guys are no doubt aware, some real world issues in trying to implement this. While these solutions can work with most any blockchain, to implement them requires approval of the group that governs the blockchain. We've already seen many blockchains fragment when one group wanted to go one way and one group wanted to go another. I don't think that's particularly good for the ultimate health of the blockchain. And the governance in many blockchains is a decentralized group of stakeholders, but some blockchains will be created by corporations or governments or other owner sponsors. So there'd be a single owner, maybe represented by a group of people, which in those blockchains, it might be easier to do. Another issue is covering the cost of reshuffling. Clearly, today's gas prices, you don't want to have to go through adding all these blocks through the normal Ethereum process if you happen to be doing this on Ethereum, or even on Bitcoin. The cost of mining the blocks would be significant. If you're making changes that go back to a very early block, you're going to have a lot of new blocks to add. But you may be able to give some special fees to miners to cover these transactions. You might have some exceptional large blocks to reduce the number of blocks that have to be appended to the new blockchain. Since the miners have already received a fee for mining these blocks the first time, you might be able to do it at some kind of a discount to reshuffle the deck. Or you could just forego the mining process and use an automated process, and maybe have some auditors reviewing that process both before and after to validate that indeed it did take place as it was supposed to do. I mean, this is why you have the PricewaterhouseCoopers type companies in the world. The rules to qualify records for removal will be dependent on what type of transactions are in the blockchain. If it's just storing information and not tracking assets, net state calculations aren't really very important. You're trying just to get that picture you posted removed, so you don't really have to have a net state. And of course, there's always the issue, if everyone has copies of the blockchain, or even without everyone, if there are copies of the old blockchain, people will still have records of that. There's nothing really to be done about that. People may just get tired of storing it. You'll have some people who maybe want to hold it for a very long time in the hope that that information will become valuable at some point. And the original blockchains itself, there may be rules, depending on your legal jurisdiction, that cover your ability to retain those records or not to retain those records. So that's pretty much it. I welcome your questions.
People can use the chat feature to ask questions, but also if anybody who wants to use their microphone to ask a question, I ask that you please use the reactions button and raise your hand so that you can be called on.
So it looks like Neil has a question.
Hi. So a question that I mean, I probably got 100 questions, but the one that strikes me as, key is if you're going to be, if there will be a residual record of the old blockchain and the new blockchain will be manipulated so that it no longer represents an indelible, immutable record of prior transactions. Why should people trust that the new blockchain will be reliable? In other words, you mentioned a situation where institutions or governments or something can mandate a particular blockchain, and in that case, it's done by coercion. But I mean, with Bitcoin and some of the other blockchains that people voluntarily participate in, the basis is the not a central authority, but a decentralized mechanism where everybody trusts that the blockchain will remain indelible. And you've now taken that condition away. Why should people trust that the blockchain will be, trustworthy, I guess?
Well, you haven't made the blockchain, you haven't removed immutability from the blockchain. You still have a validated record going back to the initial seed transaction. It may be taken offline and stored in, Iron Mountain or something. This is all a matter of complying with privacy regulations, which are, which are cropping up everywhere, and it's a matter of trying to get the best of both worlds. But you still maintain the complete integrity of the blockchain. It's just you now need to put together several versions. If you've gone through this process 10 times in the last 10 years, for example, you will have to start with the original version, add the transactions, almost like the yearbook example. You now add the yearbook for 2022, then you add the yearbook for 2023, and you can build it back if you indeed have a belief that there is some corruption somewhere along the line. But
with all due respect, I'm not sure that addresses my question, because what I'm saying is that the current mechanism is a decentralized model of trust, where you trust that all of the various copies of the blockchain are self-consistent and essentially immutable, or at least there's a consensus value as to them, and they're not centrally managed by one central authority that can monkey with things. And so now you've created a central authority that can monkey with things. Why should voluntary participants on a blockchain trust the central authority that is monkeying with things? You're saying, well, the original copy, the authoritative copy of the earlier transactions is at Iron Mountain. But how do I know that?
Well, it isn't a matter of, it's a matter of each blockchain. The governance of each blockchain would have to come up with the rules for how they want to do this. I mean, this isn't so much prescriptive as just giving alternatives to, all the decentralized owners of Bitcoin or Ethereum, for example. And it may be that they can't come to an agreement on how to accomplish this. And where they store it would be something that would have to, it's almost like going to an annual meeting of a large corporation. Everyone's got to vote, and various actions get proposed and voted for or voted against. And so the group as a whole may decide, well, we want to store it here and here, you know, in these 3 locations offline. They may, you know, decide, you know, however they want to decide it. It's not taking away the power of the group. It's just allowing the group to make decisions as to how they want to handle it in order to both continue to have this immutable record as well as complying with these privacy regulations.
Thank you.
Anyone else?
I put a question in the chat, and maybe I should rephrase it a little. I just get worried that, and I'm really not an expert at all on blockchain, but I get worried that with the possibility of having to reverse various transactions, we get into more than just several versions of a blockchain. Wouldn't it not be possible for the number of versions to explode exponentially, and or for such a thing to be the victim of a denial of service attack by people reversing transactions?
Well, you're not reversing any transactions. You're, you know, at some period, and it's not like just because somebody requests that their information be withdrawn, you withdraw it that day and create a new version. That would be tedious, and it would create a massive amount of work. You might do it on an annual basis. You might do it every 5 years. You might do it quarterly. Depends on the amount of activity and the amount of requirement of the participants to remove things. So there's no, the period of time between versions, you know, it's up to the group to decide. There's no prescription in that. Does that help?
It points me in a different direction. Thank you.
Okay. Neil?
So, you know, I don't want to take other people's time, but no one had their hand up. So
Go for it.
I mean, I don't want to monopolize, but so I'm interested in the current governance of the decentralized arrangements. Is it possible for the mechanism of governance of, let's say, Bitcoin, because that's the most well-known, is it possible for them to simply deprive people of their Bitcoins by some governance action? Or would the entire, you know, I thought the whole point of it was that it would be impossible to change the record in a way that would deprive somebody of their owned property. I mean, you might be able to force a transaction, but you can't just change the record arbitrarily as to who owns what. Is that correct?
Well, yes and no. I mean, this is what happened when there was the DAO hack. And I don't know if you're familiar with that, but the original DAO hack, I believe that was Ethereum. Some ne'er-do-well stole a whole bunch of Ether. And so they elected to roll back, one group elected to roll back the blockchain to before that happened and reinstate everyone's initial transactions. And another group wouldn't buy it. And so it ended up forking Ethereum, where now there was both Ethereum and Ethereum Classic. And this is something that happens, in my view, far too often, but it's in the nascent state. Blockchains are we're still trying to get our footing on it. And so you now had 2 different blockchains, one that gave back the tokens, basically undid a bunch of transactions, and one that kept the integrity of the original blockchain because they thought the integrity was more important than the kind of legal issue of having somebody steal them. And you're always going to have this problem when you have governance. You know, the
But I
problem might
thought
be
that
simplified if you have a dictator, but it's still a governance issue.
But isn't that a feature of Ethereum that the governance can work that way? And I thought that there was no mechanism for Bitcoin to work that way. But
Oh no,
you
it's
know,
the same. It's the same. They're both the same decentralized, you know, kind of voting system, and you basically and anytime, you know, Bitcoin is constantly being changed, being updated. There's changes to the code. There's a bunch of people who spend a lot of their time making improvements to Bitcoin, just as there are at Ethereum. Ethereum's about to undergo a major change, go from proof of work to proof of stake. And it has to be approved by the kind of stakeholders at large.
well, have there been any forks of Bitcoin
Yes.
the way there has been with Ethereum?
Yes.
What can you explain the circumstances of those?
I don't remember, but probably somebody else on the call can fill in on that one. That happened a while back. And Ethereum has gone through subsequent breaches where there's now also a third Ethereum called Ethereum SV for Satoshi Vision. Ethereum Classic basically split in two. I mean, this can happen anytime in most blockchains, especially ones that are fully decentralized where there's no direct owner. Does anyone here recall what the Bitcoin break was that we now have multiple Bitcoins? Well, no one willing to speak anyway.
So if I can just follow up to that. So
Yeah.
if you have 3 different versions of Ethereum,
Mm-hmm.
How do you sell a coin?
Well, what happened using the Ethereum as an example is you now, if you had 20 Ether before the fork, you now had 20 Ether on the main Ethereum and you had 20 Ether on Ethereum Classic. But the value of the two were different. They became they're not tethered to each other in any way. They're not pegged to each other. So Ethereum Classics were substantially less than the primary Ethereum.
And so now if you sell on one, what happens to the other?
You can sell, they're completely independent blockchains at this point. So you sell on one, you still have the other. It's like getting a dividend. You now have Ether on both blockchains, but it's a matter of, are people still, if you have Ether, let's say at $50 and it forks and you now have Ether in Ethereum Classic, will the market maintain that value of $50 or will it drop it maybe to 40 and give 10 to Ethereum Classic? It's a supply and demand question. There's no rule. It's whatever the market will bear. And it turned out the main Ethereum kind of maintained its value. Ethereum Classic had a lesser value and still has a lesser value, but they've both increased over time. And they're just now completely independent blockchains. There's nothing in common. You know, there's Ethereum and Ethereum Classic and Ethereum Satoshi Vision are as different as Bitcoin and Solana and you know, Tether. Well, not Tether, but Tether's not a blockchain, it's just a coin. Tezos. It's just another blockchain.
Thanks for answering my beginner's questions.
Yeah, no problem. We're all beginners in blockchain.
This may be outside of what you're covering, but
If you're talking, David, you're muted. You're muted again. There we
Okay.
go.
Okay, this may be outside of what you're covering, but is there a credit rating on Bitcoin? Is there collection agencies on Bitcoin? All of your transactions are anonymous, correct?
Pseudonymous, not anonymous. I don't know if that's a point that I need to dwell on, but I'll explain it if that's unclear.
Well, I mean, like, how do you make sure that you get your goods that you pay for? How do you complain if you don't get your goods?
That's problematic. One of the problems with most blockchain transactions is if I decide to use my Bitcoin to buy a pizza, the Bitcoin blockchain records the fact that I transferred some amount of Bitcoin to the pizza store. It does not record the fact that the pizza store gave me a pizza. So there's a record of payment. There's not a record of goods received. Now, that's not to say you couldn't record the goods received, but most blockchain transactions, especially blockchains that are geared towards cryptocurrencies, are one-way transactions by the seller or the transferor, not necessarily the seller. So when Alice with 20 Bitcoin gave 5 to Bob, she did that transaction. Bob had no say in it. I mean, he probably agreed, they probably made an agreement personally, but on the blockchain, it just shows that Alice gave 5 to Bob to put 5 of her Bitcoin in Bob's account. Bob didn't have any interaction with the blockchain other than he maybe afterwards said, "Thank you, Alice." But he didn't say that on the blockchain. It's not recorded. Not to say it couldn't be, but most blockchains aren't geared towards supply chain. They're just kind of one-way transactions.
I thought you said it's recorded on the seller only. So if Alice gave the Bitcoin, then she's the buyer, right?
Well, Alice has 20 Bitcoin and she gives 5 to Bob. She initiates a transaction saying, "I hereby give my 5 Bitcoin to account 1234, which happens to be Bob's account." Bob doesn't have any interaction with the blockchain itself, other than he can go and look up his account balance for account 1234 and say, "I did get those 5 from Alice. She was good to her word. She gave them to me."
Well, I mean, when we say seller, I think that, you have goods, and the person who gives away the goods is selling the goods, and the other person.
Well, let's say transfer rather than seller, then, yeah, is probably an easier term. She's the transferor of the payment. Let's say she gave Bob 5 Bitcoin, not because she was just being nice to Bob, because she was buying a pizza from Bob's pizza store. So she would give him 5 Bitcoin. Bob would see that he received them, they're in his wallet, and he would give her the pizza. Similar to what you do with a credit card. I mean, a credit card might record who the transaction was with, but all the credit card shows is that you owe the pizza store for the pizza you bought. It doesn't show that the pizza store gave you a pizza. You don't know what that transaction was for. It doesn't record the fact that you got a pepperoni or a meat lover's pizza for your 5 Bitcoin.
Okay, sort of like the bank. You're keeping records for the bank when you fill out your with your checkbook is debits and credits, but that's not your debit, that's not your credit, that's the bank's debit and credit. You're keeping the bank. So
Yeah.
we talk about selling anyway. Sorry.
No problem. Anyone else?
Just speculating on government, the government's opinion about these, how intrusive it'll be, regulating, getting information from these blockchains. attaching it specifically to individuals. I mean, some of them have developed to be anonymous, but the government, of course, has ultimate say over what organizations do in their own domain. So I'm just curious about what the future looks like for some of these things.
Well, that's one of the interesting things about blockchains, because many, and certainly all the popular ones you know of, are multinational. They're not American blockchains. They're not, British blockchains or Russian blockchains or Ukrainian blockchains. They're just blockchains. Now, what governments have done to try to stop money laundering and terrorist financing is they've implemented regulations for their own citizenry. So if you want to buy a large number of Bitcoin over a certain value, you have to go through an exchange, and that exchange is required to get certain information about you. So even though theoretically the blockchain is anonymous, the exchange knows who you are, and they know what account number you're using, you've used, and they have all these facts about you that they're required by their governments to get. And most of the developed nations have implemented these know your customer KYC regulations, requiring that transactions over X amount, and it probably varies from country to country, the exchange is obliged to collect this know your customer information, so that if someone is trying to transfer $1 million to a terrorist group or launder money because they're a criminal organization, that's more easily trackable by the FBI or whomever, whatever law enforcement agency is trying to track it. And as much as even smaller amounts are, pseudonymous, you have groups like Chainalysis, which does an excellent job of kind of tracking things like on Bitcoin to find out who's, when people are scamming and stealing all this money, they're tracking it. And the people like the FBI do it too, but they also use services like Chainalysis. And that's how they're able to capture some of these people. Recently there was this married couple that were accused of money laundering or something of a large amount of cryptocurrency, and they basically were able to track them through their various accounts. So some of the privacy dreams of Bitcoin aren't quite there, although then you have other blockchains such as Monero, which have additional features in their implementation to try to disguise who's doing what to whom. And while that's good for anonymity, it's bad when it comes to terrorist financing or money laundering. Now, of course, terrorist financing, it's a matter of who are the terrorists. If you happen to be fighting a group that has power, so that you're considered the terrorist rather than them, just because they have the power and you don't, that's unfortunate. You may be, the American Revolution was founded by a bunch of people who would have been considered terrorists, and people giving them money would have been considered financing terrorism.
You had mentioned that, when you buy a pizza, it doesn't record the fact that you bought a pizza. But I thought that Ethereum and several other blockchains had these smart contracts where there was, in fact, a mechanism to condition the transfer of the coin or something else on some external event or some.
You are correct. That's one of the failings that that prompted Ethereum's creation, was that it didn't allow, Bitcoin itself didn't really allow that. Ethereum was created to support the concept of smart contracts, and smart contracts can be created specifically to do that tracking, as you mentioned. So you're absolutely right. Now, smart contracts aren't a function of Ethereum. They're Ethereum supports them. And so depending on who develops your smart contract, there's a lot of issues with smart contracts, and they don't all work the same way. So you have to be very careful about what smart contract you're using to make sure it's meeting your needs and that it's secure. When I mentioned this DAO hack that caused the forking of Ethereum, the DAO was basically a smart contract, and some hackers figured out how to breach it and steal all the ether. So, and smart contracts are being hacked all the time. So, yes, that's one of the features Ethereum enabled. They didn't create the smart contracts, but they enabled them in the way they structured Ethereum, and that was its main forte. The reason it's become as popular as it has, it's supported smart contracts, so you can have things like NFTs and ICOs when those were popular a couple of years ago. Those were all smart contracts that were implementable because Ethereum allowed that. It provided itself as a platform for those functions. So it's not native to the blockchain, but the ability to support smart contracts is native. Anyone else? I'm not sure how we're doing on time, but.
So we have about 2 minutes left of the presentation. If anybody has any last minute questions. Going once.
Just in case anybody wants to donate their remnants of their blockchain items, as was discussed earlier, they can send them to me.
Give us your account number.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Jeff, for a wonderful presentation. We really appreciate that. So just looking ahead, at 12:35, we're going to have another talk about structural health monitoring by our very own Joe Jessen. So right now, we're just going to take a quick 10-ish minute break before we come back for the next talk.
How you doing, group?
Hi, I'm doing well, Professor Jessen. How are you?
Oh, pretty good. I just got myself a little bit of coffee here.
Oh, I'm envious.
It looks like it's going pretty good today. I sat in on a few I really liked.
Yeah, we've had really cool talks today. I'm excited.
Yeah. Do you want me to see if I can see my, let me try to share it to what I've got here.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Try and share your screen.
The thing is, I have so much up, it's just ridiculous.
Joe, your students have done a marvelous job today. Very professional.
Wow. I'll have to give them extra credit, Lou.
Definitely.
Oh. Yes, please.
Can you see it now?
Yep, it looks good.
You want me to go into full view mode? Let's see.
Yeah, I think that would be best for the talk.
All right, let me click on that. Okay. How's that look, Lou? Krupa, does that look all right?
Yeah, no, that looks good.
It looks perfect.
Okay, good. I wanted to start out with a little, eye-catching front page here. Let me grab some more coffee here. Should comb my hair. Did you get all your speakers to sign a model release? Let's see. Okay. And what do you have to do to roll this over? I guess it's all up and ready to go, huh?
Yep.
Very good. Let me get this out of the way here. We have a good attendance today.
Yeah, it's been good so far. I think we had around like 35 people in the last talk.
Whoa.
Yeah.
I gotta do some serious entertainment.